There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the weight of another person's head on your shoulder. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. You can't. The gravity of a choice is only ever felt in retrospect, when you trace the path back from where you are to the single, unassuming pressure point where the entire landscape of your future shifted. For me, that moment wasn't a grand declaration or a cataclysmic event. It was the soft click of a deadbolt not turning. It was the conscious decision to leave my door, unlocked. And it was all because of the man asleep on my couch, his breath a warm, rhythmic tide against my collarbone. His name was Alex, and at that point, he was a collection of sounds and routines that had woven themselves into the fabric of my life. He was the heavy, confident footsteps on the ceiling of my apartment, the muffled cadence of his voice on late-night work calls, the occasional, startling thud of a dropped weight from his morning workout. He was the neighbor upstairs, a man who existed in a sphere just above my own, physically and, for a long time, metaphorically. But on that particular night, and on so many nights that had begun to blur into one long, continuous stretch of tentative hope, he was here. He was a solid, breathing reality in my space, his long limbs folded into the compact architecture of my small sofa, his head tucked into the curve of my neck, as if it were a space carved out specifically for him. I had been a photographer for years, my job to observe, to frame, to capture the subtle interplay of light and shadow, but I had never studied anything as intensely as I studied the way the lamplight caught the stray strands of his dark hair. My own heart was a frantic, caged bird against my ribs, a traitorous drumbeat in the otherwise profound silence of the room. I was terrified he would wake, not because of any awkwardness, but because the spell would be broken. In sleep, he was simply a man seeking comfort. Awake, he was Alex, my friend, the man I had been quietly, hopelessly in love with for 2 years. And in the waking world, there were rules. There were boundaries drawn in invisible ink, lines we both implicitly understood and never, ever crossed. But in the quiet theater of my living room, after midnight, with the city a distant, slumbering beast outside my window, those lines had become blurred. They had smudged and bled into something new, something undefined and terrifying and beautiful. I held my breath, listening to this ritual, this strange, unspoken arrangement of him finding refuge in my apartment, had started weeks ago. But the decision that had enabled it, the choice to leave my door unlocked for him, felt like the truest confession I had ever made. It was a silent invitation, a declaration of trust one was not sure I was brave enough to have him accept. And yet, here he was. He had walked through. To understand how we arrived in that quiet tangle of limbs and unspoken feelings, you would have to go back to the beginning. I had moved into the building 3 years prior, drawn by the large, north-facing windows of the third-floor unit, perfect for the soft, indirect light I preferred for my portrait work. The apartment itself was a vessel for quiet. It had old hardwood floors that sighed underfoot and thick, plaster walls that absorbed sound, creating a peaceful cocoon in the heart of a clamoring city. For the first year, my life was a study in solitude. My days were spent in the darkroom, the alchemical smell of fixer and stop bath clinging to my clothes, or out on the streets, my camera a shield between me and the world. I observed life. I did not feel I was a part of it. I had friends, of course, but my work and my nature conspired to keep me at a comfortable distance. I was a watcher, a framer of moments, content to live in the spaces between things. Alex was the exception. He was the life I was supposed to be observing, not interacting with. He lived on the 4th floor, directly above me. I met him, cliché as it sounds, over a misdelivered package. It was a large, flat box containing expensive archival paper from my printer. I found it propped against my door one evening, his apartment number, for B, scrawled on the label, while mine was 3B. I remember hesitating, my natural aversion to interacting with strangers warring with my sense of obligation. I could have just left it, but it was important, and I imagined the person upstairs waiting for it. So I took a deep breath, picked up the heavy box, and ascended the flight of stairs that felt, at the time, like a significant social barrier. When he opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the light. His apartment was the inverse of mine, all south-facing windows, and the late afternoon sun was pouring in, setting the dust motes dancing in a brilliant, chaotic ballet. It backlit him, turning his silhouette into a dark shape against a blindingly bright background. I couldn't see his features clearly, just a tall, well-built frame and a halo of light around his hair. He was the physical embodiment of the world outside my quiet, shadowed cave. "Hi," I managed, hoisting the box. "I think this is yours. I'm Liam, from 3B. He stepped forward, out of the light, and his face came into focus. He had a kind, open face, with laugh lines already forming at the corners of his eyes, and a smile that seemed to start there before spreading to his mouth. It was a genuine, unguarded expression that immediately disarmed my carefully constructed defenses. "Oh man, thank you. I've been waiting for this." "Alex," he took the box from me with an ease that suggested it weighed nothing, his hand brushing mine for a fraction of a second. A spark, a tiny jolt of static electricity, passed between us. I was sure it was just the dry winter air, but my skin remembered the contact long after he had retreated into his apartment. "It's for my girlfriend," he explained, setting the box down. "She's an architect, always printing out massive blueprints. I'm just the designated package mule," he laughed, a warm, easy sound that filled the hallway. "Hey, listen, to thank you, you like Thai food? I was just about to order. My treat." My internal programming screamed at me to decline, to retreat to my safe, quiet space, to say, "No, thank you, it was no problem," and disappear back down the stairs. But something in his open, expectant expression made me pause. It was the loneliness, I think. Not his, but my own. I suddenly felt it as a physical presence, a cold weight in my chest. He was offering a bridge across the chasm of anonymity that separates neighbors in a big city, and for some reason, I found myself wanting to cross it. "Yeah," I said, the word surprising me as much as it probably surprised him. "Thai sounds great." That was the beginning. Our friendship didn't erupt, it seeped. It grew slowly, organically, like moss on the north side of a tree. It was built on a foundation of casual meals, of him knocking on my door to borrow a corkscrew, of me texting him to ask if his music was a little loud, only for him to text back an apology and an invitation to come up and listen with him. He was a consultant, his life a whirlwind of flights, hotels, and client dinners. He was gregarious, charming, and seemed to collect friends as easily as he collected air miles. I was his opposite, anchored, quiet, with a social circle that was small and carefully curated. We were an odd pairing, the sun-drenched apartment and the shadowed one, but it worked. He brought the world to my door. He'd return from a trip to London or Tokyo with stories that felt like movies, and he'd tell them on my couch, his energy crackling in my quiet space. In return, I offered him a sanctuary. My apartment became his decompression chamber, a place where he could shed the skin of the charming consultant and just be Alex. He seemed to crave the stillness I cultivated. He'd watch me work in my makeshift darkroom, a small, windowless bathroom I'd converted, fascinated by the slow, magical process of an image emerging from nothing on a sheet of paper submerged in chemicals. He called it my alchemy lab. "I don't get it," he said once, leaning against the doorframe, a silhouette in the dim red safe light. "You spend hours making one picture. I take 100 photos a day on my phone and never look at them again." "That's the difference," I explained, my hands gently rocking the tray. "You're capturing a memory. I'm trying to create a feeling." He was quiet for a long time, just watching the ghost of a face slowly sharpen into focus in the tray. It was a portrait I had taken of a stranger, an old woman sitting on a park bench, her face a roadmap of a long life. "A feeling," he repeated, his voice soft. "I think I get that." It was in these quiet, shared moments that my feelings for him began to change. They didn't shift overnight. It was more like a slow developing process, an image gradually appearing in the chemical bath of our friendship. At first, It was just a heightened awareness. I noticed the way his eyes would crinkle when he truly smiled, the way he'd run a hand through his hair when he was stressed, the specific cadence of his footsteps on the floor above me, a rhythm I could now identify as uniquely his. I started to feel his presence in my apartment even when he wasn't there, a lingering warmth, the ghost of his laughter. The real turning point, the moment the image in the developer tray became undeniably clear, happened about a year into our friendship. He was dating a woman named Sarah, the architect for whom I had delivered the package of blueprints. She was smart and beautiful and ambitious, and she was perfect for him. They were a golden couple, the kind of pair that people stopped to look at. I liked her genuinely. But when Alex talked about her, a subtle shadow would fall over his features, a flicker of something I couldn't name. It was a dissonant note in the otherwise perfect symphony. One evening, he came down to my apartment after a date. He was supposed to have proposed. He'd shown me the ring weeks before, a beautiful, simple band of white gold. He'd been a mess of nerves and excitement. But when he appeared at my door, his face was pale and his shoulders were slumped. He just walked in, sank onto my couch, and stared at the floor. I didn't ask. I just went to the kitchen and made him a cup of tea, the way my mother used to for me when I was a kid and the world felt too big. I put the mug in his hands and sat in the armchair opposite him, giving him space. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "I couldn't do it, Liam," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't look at me. He just stared into the steam rising from the mug. I had the ring in my pocket. We were at our place, the restaurant where we had our first date. It was all perfect, and I just couldn't. "Why not?" I asked, my voice gentle. He shook his head, a gesture of complete and utter confusion. "I don't know. I love her. I do. But when I imagined it, the rest of my life, it felt like I was looking at a picture of someone else's future. A beautiful picture. But it wasn't me in it." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying mix of relief and self-loathing. What the hell is wrong with me? And in that moment, watching him, so lost and so vulnerable, it hit me. It wasn't a crush. It wasn't a fleeting attraction. It was a deep, resonant, and terrifying love. It was a love that wanted to see him happy, but a selfish, human part of me was screaming with a relief that mirrored his own. I saw him. Not the charming consultant, not the golden boyfriend, but the man underneath, the one who was looking for a feeling, not just a picture-perfect life. And I loved that man. I loved him with a quiet, hopeless intensity that felt like it could crack me open from the inside. I pushed my own feelings down, burying them under a layer of concerned friendship. "There's nothing wrong with you, Alex," I said, and my voice was steady, a betrayal of the earthquake happening inside me. "You just want it to be real. That's all." He looked at me, a long, searching look. It felt like he was seeing me for the first time. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Real." That night, he fell asleep on my couch. It was the first time. He didn't mean to. The emotional exhaustion just pulled him under. I found a blanket and draped it over him, my hand hesitating for a moment over his shoulder before I pulled back. I watched him sleep for a long time, my heart a dull, painful ache in my chest. This was my role, the safe harbor, the quiet friend. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was all I could ever be. The breakup with Sarah was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow, quiet erosion. It happened a few weeks after the night of the non-proposal. They both knew it was over. It was amicable, mature, and civilized, which in some ways seemed to make it harder for Alex. There was no villain to blame, no righteous anger to fuel him. There was just a vast, empty space where his future was supposed to be. He was adrift on a sea of his own making, and my quiet apartment became his only lighthouse. It started subtly. A text late at night. "You up?" Followed by a soft knock on my door a few minutes later. He wouldn't have a reason, not a real one. He'd just stand there in my doorway, looking tired and lost, his shoulders slumped. "Just didn't want to be alone," he'd mutter, and I'd step aside and let him in. He'd sink into his now customary spot on the couch, and I'd sit in my armchair. Sometimes we'd talk about his work, about my latest photography project, about anything and nothing. We'd talk until the words ran out, leaving a comfortable, shared silence in their wake. More often than not, he'd fall asleep right there, his head lolling to the side, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion he carried around like a second skin. The first few times, I would wake him gently after an hour or so. "Hey, you should probably go up to your own bed," I'd say, and he'd startle awake, looking disoriented and almost embarrassed. He'd mumble an apology and shuffle out, leaving the air in my apartment feeling strangely empty and cold. His absence was a presence in itself. I would stand in the middle of my living room after he left, the impression of his body still on the couch cushion, and I would feel the silence of my own life press in on me. So I stopped waking him. I let him sleep. I'd finish my work or read a book, and when my own eyes grew heavy, I would simply drape the familiar blanket over him and retreat to my bedroom, leaving him to the quiet sanctuary of my living room. I told myself it was an act of kindness, a simple gesture for a friend who was hurting. But I knew it was more than that. It was a selfish act. Having him there, safe and peaceful in my space, was a balm to the lonely ache in my own chest. It was a borrowed intimacy, a temporary illusion of a life I desperately wanted. I was living on scraps, on the periphery of his sleep, and I was pathetically grateful for them. Then came the night that changed the texture of the ritual. He'd had a brutal week, flying back and forth between 2 different cities for a project that was falling apart. He arrived at my door well after midnight, looking hollowed out. The usual pretense of conversation was gone. He walked in, dropped his bag by the door, and just looked at me, his eyes dark with a bone-deep weariness. "Liam," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Can I just crash here? The couch. I don't think I can make it up the stairs." "Of course," I said, my heart doing a familiar, painful lurch. He didn't just sink onto the couch this time. He lay down, curling onto his side, facing the back of the sofa. I was sitting in my armchair, trying to read, but the words on the page were a meaningless jumble. All of my senses were focused on him. The sound of his breathing, the tension in his shoulders, the sheer fact of his presence in my home, not as a visitor, but as someone seeking refuge. An hour passed. I thought he was asleep, but then he shifted, turning over to face me. "It's too quiet," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "In my apartment. It's so damn quiet." The confession hung in the air between us. It was an admission of a loneliness so profound it had become a sound, a ringing silence he couldn't escape. And in that moment, my carefully constructed role as the quiet friend felt like a cruelty. I was offering him silence, the very thing that was haunting him. "Do you want me to put on some music?" I asked softly. He shook his head, his eyes half closed. "No, just talk. Tell me about your day." And so I did. I talked. I told him about the series of portraits I was planning of night shift workers. I described the way the fluorescent lights of a 24-hour diner washed out a person's features, making them look like ghosts. I talked about a new developing technique I was experimenting with, one that created a high contrast, almost brutal honesty in the final image. I talked until my own voice grew hoarse, and all the while, he watched me, his gaze heavy and unfocused. He wasn't just listening to the words. He was anchoring himself to the sound of my voice. I was his lighthouse beam, cutting through the fog of his exhaustion and loneliness. He fell asleep mid-sentence. His eyes just drifted closed, and his breathing deepened into a slow, even rhythm. He was still on the couch, and I was still in the armchair. A gulf of a few feet of empty floor space separated us, but it felt like a universe. I watched him, my heart a tangle of love, pity, and a desperate, selfish yearning. I wanted to close that distance. I wanted to offer more than just the sound of my voice. I wanted to offer the comfort of a physical presence. But the invisible lines were still there, glowing faintly in the dark. It was a few nights later that I made the decision. He had texted me earlier in the day. "Going to be a late one. Don't wait up," but I knew what that meant. It meant he would come. He would finish his work, or his dinner, or whatever obligation was keeping him, and then, like a homing pigeon, he would find his way to my door. I finished editing a set of photos, cleaned my kitchen, and read a few chapters of a book. The clock ticked past midnight, then past 1. The silence in my apartment felt expectant. I got up, walked to my front door, and placed my hand on the deadbolt. My fingers hovered over the small, metal knob. Locking it felt like a rejection, a closing of a door he had so tentatively pushed open. It felt like sending him back to the ringing silence of his own apartment. My thumb brushed the cold metal, and then I pulled my hand away. I left it unlocked. I went to bed, my own room feeling vast and empty. I lay in the dark, my ears straining, listening for the sound of the front door opening. I was a nervous wreck, my heart thumping against my ribs. What did it mean, leaving a door unlocked for someone in the middle of the night? It felt reckless. It felt intimate. It felt like a confession I wasn't sure I was ready to make, and one I wasn't sure he was ready to hear. For an hour, there was nothing but the familiar sounds of the old building settling. I had almost drifted off to sleep, convinced he wasn't coming, when I heard it. The faintest, softest click of my front door opening and then closing. I held my breath. I heard the soft thud of his bag dropping to the floor. I heard the sigh of the couch cushions as he sat down. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay in my bed, my entire body rigid with a mixture of terror and a wild, uncontainable joy. He was here. He had accepted the invitation. He had walked through the unlocked door. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face, the sound of his soft, even breathing a distant lullaby from the other room. This became our new ritual. The unlocked door. It was an unspoken agreement, a secret contract between us. It was a symbol of a trust so profound it didn't need words. Some nights he would come, and I would wake in the morning to find the blanket I left on the couch folded neatly, a silent thank you. Some nights he wouldn't, and I would feel a pang of disappointment, a feeling I quickly chastised myself for. I had no claim on him. I was offering a sanctuary, not a cage. But the nights he was there, the knowledge of his presence in my home, just a thin wall away, was a profound comfort. It made my own solitude feel less like a state of being and more like a choice. The ritual evolved, as all things do. The distance between us began to shrink, incrementally, almost imperceptibly. It started one night when I found I couldn't sleep. The silence in my bedroom was too loud, a mirror of the silence he had described in his own apartment. I got up, a glass of water my excuse, and walked into the living room. He was there, asleep on the couch, but he was restless, tossing and turning, his brow furrowed in a troubled dream. I stood there for a moment, just watching him. The impulse was overwhelming. I didn't think. I just acted. I sat down on the far end of the couch, picking up the book I'd left on the coffee table, pretending I had just come out to read. Almost instantly, he settled. The tension in his body seemed to dissolve, his breathing evening out. It was as if my mere presence in the same room, on the same piece of furniture, was enough to soothe whatever demons were chasing him in his sleep. I sat there for hours, not reading a single word, my eyes fixed on his sleeping face. It felt like I was standing guard, protecting his peace. It was the most important job I had ever had. From then on, I would often fall asleep on the couch myself. I would wait for him to come, for the soft click of the door, and then, after a suitable amount of time, I would emerge from my bedroom, a blanket in hand, and settle onto the opposite end of the sofa. Couldn't sleep. I'd murmur, if he was still awake. He would just nod, his eyes grateful. And we would share the space, two solitary islands in the quiet sea of the night, the space between us charged with everything we weren't saying. The first time he touched me, it was an accident, a dream-fueled twitch. He had been asleep for hours, his body a still landscape under the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through my window. I was in my usual spot, propped up against the arm of the couch, a book open on my lap. He shifted in his sleep, a soft groan escaping his lips, and his hand, which had been resting on his chest, flopped over, landing on my thigh. My entire body went rigid. It was the most casual of touches, completely unintentional, but it felt like a brand. I could feel the warmth of his palm through the denim of my jeans, the slight weight of it a grounding force. I should have moved. I should have shifted away, broken the contact. It was the friendly, appropriate thing to do. But I was frozen, paralyzed by a hope so fierce it was painful. I sat there, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity, my heart a frantic prisoner in my chest. His hand didn't move. His breathing remained deep and even. He was completely asleep, oblivious to the seismic event that was taking place inside of me. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I let his hand rest on my leg, a silent, sleeping testament to a closeness I had only ever dreamed of. I watched the dawn break, the gray light slowly filling my apartment, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was past the point of no return. The accidental touch became a gateway. The boundary, once breached, became easier to cross. The next time he fell asleep, he was closer. He had started the night on his side, his back to me, but in the depths of sleep, he had rolled over, his arm flung out, his fingers brushing against my side. And then, a few nights later, he didn't even pretend to start on the other side of the couch. He came in, looking exhausted, and just sank down next to me, his shoulder pressing against mine. "Long day," he mumbled, and was asleep in minutes. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief. Every night was a new negotiation, a subtle recalibration of the space between us. My internal monologue was a constant, frantic hum. What does this mean? Am I imagining this? Is he just so tired and lonely that he would seek this comfort from anyone? Or is it me? Is it specifically me? I would analyze every breath, every sigh, every unintentional shift of his body. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the primary, most biased witness. The physical space between us was shrinking, but the emotional chasm of everything unsaid remained. I was his safe place, his comfort, his human white noise machine. But I was also in love with him, and the two roles felt increasingly incompatible. The intimacy was a sweet poison. It was everything I had ever wanted, but it was built on a foundation of ambiguity, on the plausible deniability of sleep and exhaustion. I was terrified that if I named it, if I shone a light on what was happening between us, it would all crumble to dust. He would recoil in horror, our friendship would be shattered, and my apartment would go back to being silent. The unlocked door would become a monument to my own foolishness. Then came the night his head found my lap. It was the culmination of weeks of this slow, gravitational pull. He had been particularly quiet that evening, not even offering a perfunctory long day. He had just walked in, his face a mask of strain, and laid down on the couch, his head near my feet. I was reading, or pretending to, the book a prop in this nightly play we were staging. He was restless, shifting every few minutes, unable to get comfortable. He sighed, a sound of pure frustration, and pushed himself up. "Sorry," he mumbled. "I can't. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Your apartment is the only place I feel like I can breathe, Liam. But tonight, even here, my brain won't shut up." My heart broke for him. I knew that feeling. The frantic, hamster wheel brain that wouldn't stop running. I put my book down. "It's okay," I said softly. He hesitated for a moment, and then he did something that made the air leave my lungs. He shifted down the couch, and he laid his head in my lap. He did it so simply, so naturally, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He curled onto his side, his face turned towards my stomach, and let out a long, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it for days. Time stopped. My world, which had been a chaotic flurry of anxiety and hope, suddenly went still and silent. All I could feel was the weight of his head on my thighs. All I could hear was his breathing, the sound now muffled by my shirt. I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean and vaguely like sandalwood. My hand was resting on the couch next to his head, and my fingers twitched with the overwhelming urge to touch him, to run my hand through his hair, to offer the comfort he was so clearly craving. But I didn't. I was a statue, a terrified, breathing statue. This felt different. This wasn't an accident of sleep. This was a choice. He had consciously, deliberately, placed himself in my care. The intimacy was no longer borrowed. It was being requested. My mind was screaming, "This is it. This is the moment." But what was it a moment for? Was it a confirmation of something more? Or was it the ultimate act of friendship, a testament to a trust so complete that it transcended normal boundaries? I chose to believe the latter. It was safer. It was the only way to keep my heart from shattering. So I sat there, my body aching with the tension of holding perfectly still, and I let him sleep. I rested my own head back against the couch cushions and closed my eyes, and for the first time, I let myself feel the rightness of it. The simple, profound rightness of having him here, with me, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the quiet darkness. This became the new ritual. The couch, my lap, his sleep. It happened almost every night for weeks. The pretense was gone. He would come in, sometimes with a soft, "Hey," and sometimes in complete silence, and he would just settle. And I would let him. I would sit for hours, my legs going numb, my back aching, but I wouldn't have moved for anything in the world. I learned the rhythm of his sleep, the slight twitch of his fingers when he was dreaming, the soft sigh he would make as he sank into a deeper state of rest. My hand, which had been so afraid to move that first night, eventually found its courage. It started small, a gentle, hesitant touch to his shoulder. Then, one night, my fingers found their way into his hair. It was as soft as I had imagined. I carted my fingers through it, slowly, gently, my heart pounding with the audacity of the act. He didn't startle. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a low, contented sound rumbling in his chest. And that was it. The last barrier had crumbled. From then on, my hand in his hair was part of the ritual. It was our secret language. It was me saying, "I'm here. You're safe." And it was him, in his sleep, saying, "I know." I was living in a dream, a beautiful, fragile bubble of domesticity. I was also going insane. The physical intimacy was a constant, undeniable fact, but the emotional landscape was still a complete mystery. He never spoke of it. In the mornings, if he was still there when I woke up, he would be cheerful, normal Alex. He'd make coffee, we'd talk about the day ahead, and there would be no mention of the hours he'd spent with his head in my lap, my fingers in his hair. It was as if our nights existed in a separate dimension, a place with no words, a place that vanished with the morning light. I was drowning in the ambiguity. The hope was becoming unbearable, because with hope comes the possibility of devastation. I needed to know. I needed a sign, something that couldn't be explained away by exhaustion or friendship. I needed one solid, undeniable piece of evidence that this was real, that I wasn't just a convenient, warm body. The crossing, when it finally happened, was quieter than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't a storm, it was a stillness. It was a Tuesday night, indistinguishable from all the others. The city was slick with a cold November rain, the sound a soft, percussive rhythm against my window panes. Alex had come in an hour before, soaked and shivering. I had made him change into a spare set of my sweatpants and a dry t-shirt, an act of domesticity that felt both natural and intensely charged. He had settled into his usual spot, his head on my lap, and I had my hand in its usual spot, gently tracing patterns on his scalp. He seemed to fall asleep quickly, his body heavy and relaxed against me. The only sounds in the room were the rain, the hum of the refrigerator, and our synchronized breathing. I was in my usual state of quiet analysis, my thoughts a familiar spiral of hope and fear. I was tracing the line of his jaw with my eyes, memorizing the shape of it, when his breathing changed. It was a subtle shift, a slight hitch in the rhythm. I thought he was waking up. I stilled my hand in his hair, waiting. His eyes were closed, but I had the distinct feeling that he was not asleep. Not anymore. The air in the room became thick, heavy, charged with a sudden, palpable tension. It was the silence before a storm, the feeling of the world holding its breath. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I could feel his stillness, the conscious effort of it. He was awake. He was awake, and he wasn't moving. He wasn't pulling away. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The rain tapped against the glass. A siren wailed in the distance. And in my small, warm living room, two people were frozen in a tableau of unspoken questions. My mind was racing. Say something. Do something. This is it. This is the moment. But I was terrified. What if I was wrong? What if I moved, and he flinched? What if I spoke, and the sound shattered this fragile, perfect stillness? Then he moved. It was a minuscule motion. He tilted his head back, just an inch, so that his face was turned up towards mine. His eyes were still closed, his eyelashes dark crescents against his skin. My hand was still in his hair. My entire being was focused on the few inches of air that separated my mouth from his. Liam. His voice was a ghost of a sound, a rough, broken whisper that was swallowed by the quiet of the room. It was the first time he had ever spoken from this position, from this place of profound vulnerability. The sound of my own name on his lips, in that moment, was the most intimate thing I had ever heard. Yeah, I whispered back, my voice trembling. He didn't open his eyes. He just lay there, his body preternaturally still. I could feel the tension in him, the coiled spring of 1,000 unasked questions. And then, he asked the only one that mattered. Would it be okay? 2 words. 2 simple, devastatingly vulnerable words. He didn't specify what. He didn't have to. We both knew. The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was an offering. It was permission. It was the key to a door I had been standing in front of for 2 years, too afraid to even touch the handle. And in that moment, all my fear, all my anxiety, all my carefully constructed walls of self-protection, they all just dissolved. They were washed away by the sheer, breathtaking courage of his question. He was just as scared as I was. And he was asking anyway. I didn't answer with words. Words felt too clumsy, too loud for a moment that was woven from silence and whispers. Instead, I lowered my head. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving him every possible chance to pull away, to stop me. But he didn't move. He just lay there, waiting. And then, our lips met. It wasn't a kiss of passion or of desperate, pent-up longing. It was a question. It was a confirmation. It was the softest, most tentative pressure, a gentle meeting of surfaces. It was chaste, and it was devastating. It was a quiet, mutual confession in the dark. It tasted of rain and tea and a loneliness so profound it had taken us years to find its name. It lasted only a few seconds, but it contained a lifetime of waiting. When I pulled back, he finally opened his eyes. And in the dim light of the room, I saw not confusion, not regret, but a deep, oceanic relief. A mirror of my own. He didn't say anything. He just reached up and placed his hand on my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was no longer accidental. It was deliberate. It was intentional. He closed his eyes again, and a single tear escaped from the corner of his eye, tracing a glistening path down his temple. I wiped it away with my thumb. And we just stayed like that, in the quiet, in the aftermath, his head in my lap, his hand on my face, my hand in his hair. The ritual was the same, but everything had changed. The question had been asked, and it had been answered. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. It was sharp, brittle, and full of fear. I woke up on the couch, a crick in my neck, the gray morning light filtering in. The apartment was empty. Alex was gone. The blanket was folded neatly on the armchair, a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter one hadn't known we were writing. The coffee pot was cold. There was no note. There was just a profound and echoing absence. My first thought, a cold, sickening wave of dread, was that I had imagined it, that the kiss had been a dream, a hallucination born of my own desperate wanting. But the phantom feeling of his lips on mine was still there, a ghostly imprint. The memory of his whispered question, would it be okay, was branded into my mind. It had been real, and he had run. A different, more brutal fear replaced the first. I hadn't imagined it. It had been real, and it had been a mistake. A terrible, friendship-ending mistake. I had misinterpreted everything. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the physical closeness. It had all been exactly what it looked like on the surface. A man leaning on his friend in a time of crisis. And I, in my selfish, hopeful blindness, had taken that trust and twisted it into something else. The kiss had not been a confession. It had been a transgression, and his absence was the verdict. I spent the day in a fog of self-recrimination. I walked through the motions of my life, but I wasn't really there. I went to my darkroom, but the chemical smells made me nauseous. I tried to edit photos, but the faces on the screen were just meaningless shapes. Every sound from the apartment above me was a fresh wave of anxiety. A footstep, a closing door, the sound of water running through the pipes. Was he up there regretting? Was he packing a bag, preparing to move out of the building to escape the awkward, awful mess I had created? My phone remained silent. I scrolled through our old text messages, a history of easy banter, inside jokes, and late-night check-ins. It felt like reading an artifact from a lost civilization. I composed and deleted a dozen different messages. Hey, are you okay? Too needy. About last night, too confrontational. Hope you have a good day, too casual, too fake. In the end, I sent nothing. The silence stretched, a taut wire of tension between his floor and mine. The unlocked door was the worst part. That night, as darkness fell, I stood in front of it, my hand hovering over the deadbolt, just as I had weeks before. But this time, the gesture had a different meaning. Leaving it unlocked felt pathetic, a desperate, pleading invitation he would surely ignore. Locking it felt like a final, definitive act. It was admitting defeat. It was closing the door on the most beautiful, fragile thing I had ever held. My hand trembled. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I left it unlocked, a monument to a hope that was now curdling into pain. I didn't sleep on the couch. I went to my own bed, but I didn't sleep there either. I just lay in the dark, listening for a click that I knew wouldn't come. The silence from the living room was a physical weight, pressing down on me. The apartment felt cavernous, a hollowed-out space that had once been filled with a borrowed warmth. The dawn came, and he hadn't come. The wire of tension had snapped. Another day passed in the same agonizing silence. No texts, no calls. I heard him leave his apartment in the morning and return in the evening. His footsteps on the stairs were quick, hurried. He was avoiding me. The truth of it was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. I had ruined it. I had ruined the best friendship I had ever had, all for a moment of selfish, hopeful weakness. The grief was so profound it was physical. It was a dull, constant ache behind my ribs. By the third night, something inside me broke. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. The ambiguity that had once been a source of thrilling hope was now an instrument of torture. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst-case scenario, it had to be better than this suffocating uncertainty. I needed to hear it from him. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me I had made a terrible mistake so that I could begin the long, painful process of grieving and moving on. My anger, a quiet, slow-burning thing, finally overpowered my fear. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at the silence. I was angry at the cowardice, his and my own. I put on my shoes, walked out of my apartment, and climbed the stairs to his floor. Each step was a hammer blow, a final, definitive action. I was marching towards my own execution, but at least I was marching. At least I was moving. I stood in front of his door for B. The light was on underneath. I could hear the low murmur of a television. I raised my hand to knock, and my heart was a wild animal in my chest. My knuckles rapped against the wood, the sound loud and final in the quiet hallway. The television sound cut off. Silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. I was about to turn and leave, my brief surge of courage evaporating, when I heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches. Alex stood in the gap, his face pale, his eyes wide and haunted. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't open the door further. He just stood there, a human barrier. "Liam," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "We need to talk, Alex," I said, and I was proud of how steady my own voice was. I was not going to fall apart. Not here. Not now. He flinched, a barely perceptible motion. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "It's late," he mumbled. "I'm really tired." "Don't," I said, and my voice was sharper than I intended. "Don't do that. Don't hide. You owe me more than that." He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was not anger, not disgust, but a profound and gut-wrenching fear. He looked like a cornered animal. "I can't," he whispered. You can't what? I pushed. The quiet, patient observer was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who was willing to burn everything to the ground just to see what was real. You can't talk to me? After everything? After 2 years of friendship? After Tuesday night? You're just going to pretend it didn't happen? It was a mistake, he said, the words rushing out, clumsy and desperate. I was tired. I was lonely. I've been a mess since Sarah, and I've been leaning on you, and that's not fair. I crossed a line. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Liam. The words were like stones, each one a physical blow. He was saying exactly what I had feared. It was a mistake. He was sorry. My carefully constructed world crumbled. The pain was so sharp, so sudden, it literally took my breath away. I felt my face crumple, the mask of my anger dissolving into a raw, undisguised hurt. And that's what finally broke through his fear. Seeing my face. Seeing the genuine, unfiltered pain I was in. His own expression shifted, the fear giving way to a wave of guilt and a terrible, aching sadness. Liam, he started, but he couldn't finish. He opened the door wider. Come in, he said, his voice thick. I walked into his apartment. It was the first time I had been inside in months. It was the mirror image of mine, but it felt completely different. It was sterile, impersonal. There were moving boxes stacked in one corner, even though he'd lived here for years. The south-facing windows that had seemed so bright and full of life on the day we met were now just dark, empty rectangles, reflecting the sparse, lonely room. It was the apartment of a man who was just passing through, a man who hadn't put down any roots. It was the apartment of a man who was profoundly, deeply alone. I didn't sit down. I just stood in the middle of the room, my arms wrapped around myself, a feeble attempt to hold my own shattering pieces together. He stood by the door, as if to block any escape. What you said? I started, my voice shaking. Was that true? That it was a mistake? He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of pure exhaustion. I don't know, he said, his voice ragged. I don't know what's true anymore. All I know is that I'm terrified. Terrified of what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Of me? No, he said, and he shook his head vehemently. No. God, no. Not of you. He took a step towards me, then another. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I'm terrified of what I'm feeling. I'm terrified of this. Of what happened. Because it wasn't a mistake, Liam. That's the problem. It felt more real than anything I've felt in my entire life. The confession hung in the air, a fragile, impossible truth. He had run, not because the kiss was wrong, but because it was right. My entire life, he continued, his voice cracking, I've been following a script. Go to the right school, get the right job, date the right person. Sarah was the right person. She was perfect. We looked perfect together. But it felt like I was playing a part one was really good at, but it was still a performance. And then, there was you. Your quiet apartment. Your silence. It was the only place I didn't have to perform. It was the only place I could just be. He looked around his own empty apartment, a look of dawning horror on his face. This place is just a hotel room. I've lived here for 3 years, and it's a hotel room. But your apartment felt like home. And you feel like home. He finally looked me in the eye, and his were swimming with unshed tears. And that terrifies me, because I don't know what to do with it. I've never felt this for a man, for a friend, for anyone. I kissed you, and it was like the whole world suddenly clicked into focus. And I was so scared of that feeling, of how right it was, that I ran. I ran like a coward. And I've been hiding up here, miserable, because I was too afraid to face the one true thing I think I've ever found. He stood there, completely undone, his confession a raw, open wound in the middle of his sterile living room. He had taken his own carefully constructed world and smashed it to pieces at my feet. And in the rubble, I saw not an ending, but a beginning. All my pain, my anger, my fear, it all just washed away, replaced by a wave of love so powerful it was almost dizzying. He wasn't rejecting me. He was confessing to me. In the most backward, fear-driven, and utterly human way, he was telling me he loved me too. I closed the distance between us. I didn't say a word. I just stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. He was rigid for a second, a body braced for impact, and then he just collapsed against me, his own arms coming around me, holding on like he was drowning. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I felt the warmth of his tears soaking through my shirt. And I just held him. I held him as he shook, as he finally let go of all the fear and confusion he had been carrying. I held him, and it felt like coming home. We stood like that for a long time, in the middle of his empty apartment, two broken pieces finally fitting together. There were no more words. There was no need for them. In the beautiful, honest silence, we had finally found our language. The conversation that followed was not easy. It was halting and awkward, and punctuated by long silences as we both struggled to find the words for feelings we had never been allowed to name. We sat on his uncomfortable, rarely used sofa, a careful distance between us, as if the physical charge was still too much to handle. He told me about the confusion, a lifetime of assumed identity suddenly being called into question. He spoke of the fear of judgment, not just from the world, but from himself. He confessed that the safety and comfort he found with me had become so essential, so foundational to his well-being, that the idea of it shifting into something romantic felt like risking the only anchor he had. "I was so afraid of losing you," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on his own hands, which were twisting a loose thread on his jeans. "I thought, if I admitted this, if I let it be real, you would be repulsed. Or, even worse, the friendship, the safety of it, would just evaporate. And I couldn't bear to lose that. I couldn't bear to lose you. You were never going to lose me," I said, and the certainty in my own voice surprised me. "Alex, I've been in love with you for years." His head snapped up, his eyes wide. It was clear, in his self-absorbed panic, that he had never once considered my side of the equation. He saw me only as the giver of comfort, the stable, unchanging friend. The idea that I had my own universe of feelings, my own agonizing hope and fear, had simply not occurred to him. "What?" he breathed. And so I told him. I told him everything. I told him about the day on my couch when he confessed he couldn't propose to Sarah, the moment I realized the depth of my feelings. I told him about the torture of watching him with her, the quiet ache of my unrequited love. I told him about the nights I spent watching him sleep, my heart a painful knot in my chest. I told him about the unlocked door, about the conscious, terrifying decision to leave it open for him, a silent plea he had unknowingly answered. I laid my own vulnerability bare, a mirror to his. As I spoke, I watched his face. I saw confusion melt into disbelief, then into a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. The weight of what I had been carrying, the sheer loneliness of it, was suddenly visible to him. He was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. Not as a sanctuary, not as a safe harbor, but as a person with a heart that had been breaking quietly for him for a very, very long time. When I finished, the silence in the room was different. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was full. It was weighted with the gravity of our shared confessions. He slowly, tentatively, reached across the space between us and took my hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm. "I'm so sorry, Liam," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea. I was so wrapped up in my own fear. I never even saw yours." He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to my knuckles. "All that time, you were waiting." "I would have waited forever," I admitted, my voice a whisper. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "You shouldn't have had to." He held my gaze, his eyes clear and certain for the first time. "I don't know what this is or where it's going. I don't have a map for this. But I don't want to be scared anymore. And I don't want to do it without you. Can we just figure it out? Together?" "Yes," I said, the word a simple, solid thing. A foundation. Together. We didn't kiss again that night. The emotional honesty was a new kind of intimacy, more profound and more fragile than any physical touch. We just sat there, holding hands, until the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gray. For the first time, his apartment didn't feel like a hotel room. It felt like a starting point. The days that followed were a process of careful, intentional reconstruction. We were rebuilding our relationship from the ground up on a new foundation of honesty. The easy, unspoken friendship was gone, and in its place was something more deliberate, more precious. We talked. We had real conversations, not just about our days, but about our fears, our hopes, our pasts. It was like getting to know each other all over again, but this time, with all the cards on the table. The ritual of the unlocked door and the shared couch changed. There was no more pretense. One evening, a week after our conversation, he texted me from upstairs. "Can I come down?" Not, "You up?" but a direct question, a request for entry. The door's unlocked. I texted back, and I felt a smile spread across my face. The gesture was the same, but the meaning had been transformed. It was no longer a symbol of my secret hope, but a confirmation of our shared reality. He came in, and he didn't look exhausted or lost. He just looked like Alex. He came and sat next to me on the couch, and he took my hand. We watched a movie, our shoulders pressed together, our fingers intertwined. And when he grew sleepy, he didn't just drift off. He looked at me, a soft, questioning look in his eyes. "Okay if he started. I didn't let him finish. I just pulled him down, guiding his head to my lap. He sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated contentment, and I ran my fingers through his hair. The ritual was the same, but it was no longer a secret. It was our language. It was a conscious act of love and comfort, mutually given and mutually received. We began to build a home together, not out of bricks and mortar, but out of these small, intentional moments. He started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom. I cleared a drawer for him in my dresser. His sterile, empty apartment upstairs became a ghost, a place he only went to grab his mail. His life and his things slowly, naturally, migrated downstairs to mine. My quiet, solitary space became our shared sanctuary. The silence was no longer a symptom of loneliness, but a comfortable, breathing presence, the sound of two people being perfectly, contentedly together. One afternoon, I was in my darkroom, developing a set of new portraits. The red safe light cast its familiar, otherworldly glow on everything. Alex was in the living room, a low murmur of music coming from the speakers. I was gently rocking a tray, watching a face emerge from the white paper, when he appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the light from the hall. He didn't say anything. He just leaned against the doorframe, watching me, just as he had all those months ago. I looked up at him, a ghost in the red light, and I smiled. He smiled back, a slow, easy smile that started in his eyes. He wasn't the unknowing initiator anymore, and I was no longer just the quiet observer. We were participants. We were co-authors of a new story, one we were writing together, line by line. There are moments in your life that you can trace everything back to. For us, it was a misdelivered package, a late-night confession of loneliness, a whispered question in the dark. But more than anything, it was a choice. The choice to leave a door unlocked, to risk the familiar comfort of friendship for the terrifying, beautiful possibility of something more. It was a choice to be vulnerable, to be honest, to step out of the shadows and into the light. And as I stood there, in the warm, red glow of my darkroom, with the man I loved watching me from the doorway of our home, I knew, with a certainty that filled every empty space inside of me, that it was the best choice I had ever made. We had found our feeling, and it was real.